Hey, how's it going today, Espen? My name is Jonathan Delgado, and this is from the Las Cruces Museum Systems. We're happy to have you on here. Welcome to the Science Café.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, John. Very nice to meet you all.
So, hopefully, I'm going to get to hear you talk a little bit about paleontology. Espen is a paleontologist, and you're with the Queensland Science Museum, right?
Yeah, so it's the Queensland Museum has a number of campuses across the state, and I'm up in Townsville. It's called the Queensland Museum Tropics now, and I've been here for the last 8 years now.
Oh, very nice. How's the weather out there?
Hot, very hot and humid, about 35 degrees and really high humidity.
Very nice, very
Yeah.
nice. Well, better than here because we're all pretty cold.
Yeah, okay, well that sounds good to me.
So, what do you have to share with us today?
Yeah, so I'm happy to start sharing my PowerPoint, but basically what I was going to start with, I've been on a little journey because I'm not Norwegian, so I started my career in Norway, working in the Arctic, and then I've slowly made my way here to Australia, working on initially some very similar things that I worked on in the Arctic, and then panned out to things that are more similar to what you guys can find in New Mexico. So I thought I'll share my screen, my talk. Let's see if we can get that shared. Allow. Let's see if that'll work. Can you see that now at all?
Yep, I can see it's pole to pole paleontology.
That's it. So I'll just do it like that. So we get everything in there. Yeah, so I named it pole to pole paleontology, which is perhaps a bit of a stretch, but it's if we kind of go into deep time and across till today, it is kind of pole to pole because a lot of these sites today, the first site that I'll talk to you about up in the Arctic is obviously in the North Pole area. Whereas here in Australia, if you go back to the Cretaceous and the Triassic that I'll talk to you guys about, Australia was much further south. So it was essentially within the Antarctic polar regions. So that's why kind of called it that. And it sort of highlights the point that fossils that you're finding in locations today aren't necessarily where those land masses were back in the days when those animals and plants were alive, which is very important to keep in mind when we're trying to interpret what these ecosystems looked like and what we're finding means. So
Oh, very cool.
that's sort of the connection that I've got there. So I just got a few slides here from what I did up in the Arctic. So for those of you that aren't too familiar with European geography, I'm from Norway, which is this sort of long, almost mitten-like country up in here. And we've got Greenland there, which is close to Canada. And in between Greenland and sort of northern Norway slash Russia, you got this archipelago. It's a group of islands called Svalbard, which is governed by Norway. And that's one of the few places in Norway that we can find vertebrate fossils at all, because most of the rocks on mainland Norway are way too old and from a time before vertebrates, and in particular four-limbed vertebrates, so what we call tetrapods, even had evolved. So that's why we go up to Svalbard, which back in the Jurassic was very different than it is today. Today it's quite a mountainous terrain, like you can see in the aerial and in the photo here. We've got the camp in the foreground and the field locality in the background. Whereas back in the Jurassic, which are the rocks that we were looking at there, so roughly 150 million year old rocks, the what is now this archipelago group of islands was the bottom of a sea. And because of the way plate tectonics works, plates are moving around, so bits of land will get uplifted, and sometimes what is used to be ocean floor becomes land as it gets pushed out of the ocean, which is what has happened here. So luckily for us, that allows us to see fossils of animals that lived in the ocean 150 million years ago.
So let me
So we've got
ask a couple of
Norway.
questions here, just to
Yeah, go
break
for
us
it.
up for a second. So when we're talking about this is Svalbard, you said,
Yes,
and you're saying that during the late Jurassic period, which is what you were studying out there, it was at 60 degrees north.
roughly, yes.
Okay, and it was at the bottom of a shallow sea.
Yes.
So what would the climate have been in that area, sort of in that region? Are we talking cold waters?
So what we see is across the world in the late Jurassic, the climate was quite warmer than it is today, but it's still fairly cool up there because what we see if we compare the fossils we are finding on Svalbard compared to if you just go down to where Britain is or the UK is now, we're finding quite different fossils. So we're finding similar plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, but they find a lot of crocodiles there, and we find no crocodiles at all up in the Svalbard rocks, which suggests to us that it's probably also colder climate and the crocodiles couldn't survive up there. So that sort of gives us an idea that it must have been slightly colder. And whether some of these things were migrating up and down, we still don't know. So that's sort of questions that remain to be answered, I suppose.
Crocs in the UK. All right.
Yeah. So that's yeah, sort of sets the scene, I suppose, for why we went up there and why we expected to find things as well. So I'll just very quickly show you. So this is kind of what it looks like part of the time up there. It's a very short field season because it's so far north. So we kind of got to go up there when as much of the snow from the previous winter season has melted as possible and before the new snow starts arriving. So it's sort of a 3 to 4 week window in July to August that you can go up there. And if we're lucky, we finish up there before the snow arrives. But there are also other challenges. So we've got polar bears up there, which means that you got to be on the lookout for those and carry. We don't do bear spray up there because it's a bit too windy and you risk just getting yourself in the face. And I'm not sure how effective they are in polar bears. Maybe they are good. I'm not sure. But we carry rifles up there. So we've
Better
got
you
rifles.
than me to test bear spray on a polar bear.
Yeah, might do it from a safe, very safe distance. Yeah, so we carry guns when we're up there, and even when you go to the toilet. So this is our toilet that we had in the field one year, just made out of pallets, and we have a designated what we call a dunny gun for any Australians that might be listening. Essentially a toilet rifle, which has this pink strap. So whenever you go to the toilet, you take the pink strap rifle with you and that sort of allows you to protect yourself while you're doing your business there, but it also tells everyone else that the toilet's now occupied. So it sort of serves those two purposes, which is nice. And we also got to put protection around our tents when we're sleeping. So we've got these flares that are hooked up to this tripwire. So if a polar bear comes too close, pulls out this pin here, and this flare shoots up and goes bang, and hopefully scares away the polar bear rather than towards our tents.
Now, did anybody trip on the flare at night?
Yeah, so this here is me doing it on purpose for the photographer, but but usually we usually spend about 3 weeks there, and usually in the first week, most people would forget that the tripwire is there because you're not used to it yet, and then you just walk into it, and reindeer will go through it, and the polar foxes and all sorts. So you have to sort of reset them all the time because yeah, people and animals will walk into them. So this is just very few. I mean, we collected, I can't remember how many specimens we collected there now, but I think something like 70 specimens of plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, which are these marine reptiles that were around in the Mesozoic. So plesiosaurs are these four-flipped marine reptiles. Some of them had short necks with big heads, and some of them had long necks with small heads, and they had all sorts of in-between ones as well.
So, is
But
this the
these
dinosaur I saw in Jurassic Park?
Well, the one that you saw in Jurassic Park is a mosasaur, probably, or Jurassic World. So,
Jurassic World, yeah.
yeah, so mosasaurs, are close relative of modern day snakes and monitor lizards. So they're a squamate, whereas these marine reptiles, the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, from a different branch of reptiles again, which are unrelated to dinosaurs. So they share a common ancestor with dinosaurs further back, but they are a very different group than dinosaurs. They're just big reptiles that lived in the sea, similar time as when the dinosaurs were on land, but yeah, different groups.
Oh,
Uh,
awesome. That's fascinating.
so what you can see on the ground here is what doesn't look very impressive because what happens is there's this frost layer before you get down to the permafrost, which thaws and freezes over and over and over again. So it breaks up all the bones into tiny, tiny little pieces. So this stuff that looks like mud are actually the bones of this animal that we've drawn here. So it's a pretty big. That's a 1 meter stake there, so you can sort of see the size of these bones. These are big bones from the chest that allows these big muscles of the chest to attach to the limbs for flipping these flippers up and down. So this
Definitely
is a
not hoping to run into them while I'm scuba diving, that's for sure.
definitely not. So this is a 10 to 15 meter long animal. So they're pretty significant sizes, and the teeth, the largest teeth are about the size of cucumbers. So these are definitely the apex predators of these ancient oceans.
So, for
And
those of us listening, we'll make the conversion. We're talking 45 to 55 feet animals here.
yeah, that's right. And then we have the long necked ones, which are the sort of the snacks or the food for the pliosaurs, which are these short neck ones. So you can kind of see one here in the ground. This is what it looks like after we've removed all the rock around it, and you can kind of see the neck here. You got a limb there, another limb there, and you got part of the body here. But if we're prep it out, if only it was that quick. But you can see what was in the ground. So you can see you got the body, you got part of the back limb and the two front limbs. These green bits here are the shoulder bones. And then you got the really long neck here that ends in a jumble of neck bones, but no head at the end. And I'll come back to issues with these long neck plesiosaurs, and I'll talk about the Australian work as well, because across plesiosaurs and any long necked animals that are potentially fossilized, and that includes sauropod or the long necked dinosaurs, is because the tiny little head is so far away from the body. Whenever you have the body preserved, it's usually unlikely that you're also finding the head, because it's got such a high probability of either getting lost through getting washed away in rivers or in the oceans. These plesiosaurs, when they die, they do what we call a bloat and float. It's a bit like a whale carcass. They'll float around and decompose and get scavenged on. And having a little tiny head dangling at the end of a long neck means that it's got pretty high probability of either dropping off somewhere else or getting snapped off by a scavenger or something like that. So often when we find these things, it's usually a body without a head, or if you're really lucky, you find a head without a body. And if you're extremely lucky, you have the body and the head still attached, but that doesn't happen very often. And ichthyosaurs as well, which are these dolphin-like marine reptiles. So they did the dolphin thing long before the dolphins did, about 200 million years or 230 million years before the dolphins at least. And what you can see here is one lying in the ground. You can see the tail here, and you can see ribs sort of going this way. And it's a bit tricky to see, but the head is sort of out this way here. And this is what that specimen looked like when we prepped it out. So it's essentially complete from the tip of the snout and all the way to the tail. We're just missing this little kink that these ichthyosaurs have in the tail. So if you look at shark skeletons, their vertebral column, or the vertebrae in the tail, they go up to the top tail fluke, whereas in ichthyosaurs they go down to the bottom tail fluke. So we're kind of missing that tiny little section, but you even got the tiny little back limbs that have been reduced in size and the front limbs there. So we've got some really good material from there, and we've got several new species and new genera of these marine reptiles from Svalbard. So it's a really productive site, probably one of the more productive ones in the world. So it was a really exciting project to be part of. That sort of ties me over to what I'm doing here in Queensland, because if we go bit forward in time, so from 150 to roughly 120, 110 million years ago. If we go down to Australia, so we're up in here before, that's Greenland, and Svalbard would have roughly been around in here in the Cretaceous period. We would go right to the other side of the planet to Australia, which was sort of tilted clockwise 90 degrees at the time from what it is now. So Queensland, which is here on the Australian coast, Townsville, where I am now, is roughly there. And we had this inland sea. So sea levels in the late Cretaceous, early Cretaceous, were higher than what they'd just been before. But we also had some subsidence of the land. So during the movement of continents, you don't just get elevation, so things getting pushed up and made into mountains, but sometimes continents also stretch apart, which can create these sort of subsidence or down warping of the landmass, which means that it becomes lower than the surrounding areas, because essentially these plates are all floating on the sort of semi-viscous or semi-liquid mantle that's sitting underneath, so sort of buoyant, floating around. So if something becomes heavier or thinner or thicker, it can either float higher up, or it can float or sink into the mantle. So that's what happens. We got this big inland sea in the late Cretaceous, early Cretaceous here in Australia. So when we go out here into what we call the outback, or the badlands, if you like, or the desert, we're finding fossils of these animals that were living in that inland sea. And we're finding, obviously, different clams, bivalves, like you'd expect to find crustaceans. This is a nice prawn molt that a student found not long ago. So you can see this is a concretion, so it's a nodule, and the student cracked it open with a hammer. And inside you can see the head of the prawn here, so that's this part here. And then you got the body and the tail going out here, and you got the legs sort of dangling down below here. So this is a prawn that's it's broken out of its shell here, just like crabs and insects. They sort of have their skeleton on the outside. So to grow, they got to shed their old skeleton and grow and expand while the new skeleton is still soft. So they break out from between the head and the body. So the prawn would have come out of here and left this molt, that we call it, to this old skeleton behind, and it fossilized over 120 million years before we found it. And starfish as well, or sea stars. This is a resting trace, or we call it trace fossils. This is a starfish that's crawled across this sand in the shallow beach environment and then dug down a little bit and then moved on and left this trace behind for us to find. So that's pretty cool as well. We do find marine reptiles again, so we find plesiosaurs and we find ichthyosaurs. And I'll just put a mosasaur in here, which is what we spoke about before from Jurassic World. We don't find those really here
So
much in
importantly, not a
Australia.
mosasaur.
No. So we don't really find mosasaurs here because mosasaurs originated in the late Cretaceous period. So after the inland sea here in Queensland had retreated and it had become land. So if you want to find fossils of mosasaurs, we can find some in Western Australia that have late Cretaceous rocks, some bits and pieces, but mostly in New Zealand. But you find them a lot in the US, and that's because you had a similar inland sea, but in the late Cretaceous called the Western Interior Seaway, and you find a lot of these mosasaurs in there as well. And I think I'm not sure
Is
if you
that
got
why when we're here in New Mexico, I know that you can find marine fossils? Would
yes.
there have been water out here in the Southwest, then you're saying?
Yes, at different points in time, but definitely in the late Cretaceous. If you got any late Cretaceous rocks, it's possible that they can have fossils from this Western Interior Seaway. So you might find things like ichthyosaur and plesiosaur remains. Oh, actually, you won't find ichthyosaurs because ichthyosaurs were actually went extinct before the late Cretaceous, but you would find plesiosaurs and mosasaur remains, perhaps, and turtles and crocodiles and things like that. So that's possible to find in your region as well, and all the way up. So this Western Interior Seaway sort of stretched right across from the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains and pretty much all the way through Canada and out to the other side. And this is kind of brings me to what I spoke about before, but this long-necked plesiosaurs is that their heads fall off, and you find bodies without heads, and we find heads without bodies, and that's the same issue here in Queensland. Before I came here, we have a head in the collection with no body, and we have plenty of bodies without heads. So we go like, okay, well, how many species do we actually have here? Because we don't know if this head actually belongs to these kinds of bodies, or are there two? They seem like there's two different kinds of bodies. So which of those bodies does this head belong to? So we got that sort of tricky trying to connect those two without having anything overlapping. So we're sort of stuck in a limbo when it comes to how many species we've got and which species what they look like. So what we really needed was some specimens that have those both of those, both the head and at least part of the body together, so we can start joining those parts of these animals together. And what we have here in Queensland is we have big farms, cattle farms, that are run by privately owned companies or people. And some of those people are interested in fossils. So when they find fossils, they call us up and tell us about it. And that's what happened a few years ago. And we went out. This is the station owner here. She took us out there. We got an excavator and we dug this plesiosaur up. So what you can see here is long neck. When you get to the body here and shoulder area, that's the front flipper, that's the body. And you got the hind flippers and the tail right there. So this one again, unfortunately, didn't have a head, but she had found two, and she'd found a smaller one that also had the head still attached. You can see the head there. That's a close-up of the head. And you got the neck in here, and this is part of the shoulder region sticking in there. So that means that finally we had this connection between the head and the body, and now we're working on sort of unraveling that mystery with what bodies go with different heads, and can now figure out what was the diversity or how many species of these plesiosaurs did we have. And now we have the head as well. We can start learning much more about how these animals lived in these ecosystems too. So that's great. So that's really good news for us, and we hope to find more of these into the future, obviously.
Okay, so that's actually a
Yeah,
lot very similar to here in New Mexico. We have a lot of ranching businesses out here, and I think our most famous paleontology site is on a ranch, Ghost Ranch. Are you
that's
familiar with
right.
that?
That's right. Which kind of brings me to these next slides that I want to talk about as well, because this is a connection.
All
It's
right.
probably a stronger connection than the marine to New Mexico. So this Triassic connection that we have across Australia through Antarctica, South Africa, North South America, and into North America, including New Mexico. So this Triassic period, so the Triassic starts at about 252 million years ago, right after the end Permian extinction. So we got the biggest or worst, if you like, mass extinction in the history of our planet, where about 90 to 95% of all life on our planet disappeared forever. and just pretty much, nearly wiping out pretty much everything, because 90 to 95%, that is a lot. That is more than 9 out of 10 species getting wiped out near extinction. So I suppose the good thing for us is that at the after following such an extinction event, you pretty much start in a clean slate, right? So everything that was before has been wiped out, and everything that survived has sort of an open playground, if you like. And this is when we start seeing the origin of a lot of modern fauna. So things like mammals start evolving, lizards and snakes, and their ancestors, frogs and modern amphibians, and turtles. We start seeing the first turtles, but also crocodiles, and even probably more excitingly for most people, dinosaurs. We start seeing the first ancestors of dinosaurs and the first dinosaurs in the Triassic period. So it's a very going from a mammal ancestor dominated ecosystem in the Permian to going to a much more reptile dominated ecosystem in the Triassic, and you're going much
So
more
you're
into
saying that during the Permian, we had this era where we had mammals and some other different creatures, and we had this mass extinction, and then we get the Triassic period, which is the beginning of our true dinosaurs.
that's right. So some of your audience might have heard the term mammal-like reptile, which is what people used to call them in the past. Now we call them stem mammals or proto-mammals. So essentially the line of animals that eventually evolved into mammals as we know them. But in the Permian, those group of animals were much more dominating in the ecosystem than they were following that. And they were sort of the first large carnivore and herbivore ecosystems on our planet. And then they were wiped out in the Permian, and the reptiles much more started taking over. So you can see this big change in the global ecosystems in that time period, which is why it's a very important time frame to try and understand, because it teaches us a lot about what do extinctions do and how do things recover afterwards on a local and global scale in different
And do we
environments.
know what caused that mass extinction?
So there are a number of different reasons, and some of them are connected. But the main reason is big volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia. You got what we call the Siberian traps. So you have this region of massive, not necessarily explosive volcanism, but long duration, slow release of gases, including greenhouse gases, sulfur dioxides as well, that causes acidity in the environment, and just changed both global temperature but also global ocean and freshwater chemistry. So you get this 8 to 10 degree at least increase in global temperature, which is much more than we're looking at now. But still what we're looking at now with this short time frame is significant. But this was drawn out over a much longer time, thousands of years, but still such a big change that ecosystems really struggle to deal with it, and therefore of course this ecosystem collapses. So we got these big volcanic eruptions up in this region here, causing all this havoc across the world, essentially causing these extinctions.
Now,
So
is this real fast? Is this where we get our state fossil? This is the era. I know our state fossil is Coeliophysis, which was found over at Ghost Ranch. They had a whole
yeah.
number of them over there. And are those a Triassic period dinosaur?
Yes, they are a Triassic. So they're towards the end of the Triassic period. So dinosaurs, as you know them from Coelophysis, for instance, came from other animals that kind of looked like that, but started probably in the early Triassic as quadrupedal or walking on all fours sort of animals, and then slowly evolved into bipedal or two-legged animals, walking on two legs with a tail like Coelophysis, and very closely related to the ancestors of pterosaurs as well. So your listeners probably knows about pterosaurs, and they're actually a sister group to dinosaurs, evolving from ancestors that are very similar to the ancestors of dinosaurs. But they were sort of, up until the middle part of the Triassic period, they were sort of overshadowed by close relatives and ancestors of modern day crocodiles called pseudotsuchians, which during the middle Triassic and into the late Triassic as well kind of looked like some dinosaurs looked like in Jurassic and Cretaceous. Some of them looked like ankylosaurs, that are these armored plated dinosaurs, and some of them looked like, almost T-Rexy like things walking on legs with a big head. So crocodiles is kind of doing the dinosaur things before dinosaurs were doing it later on,
Oh,
which
that's
is kind
pretty
of
cool.
interesting as well. And there was another extinction within the Triassic period that And at the end of the Triassic period, that sort of wiped those out that gave dinosaurs sort of their chance in the Jurassic and Cretaceous. So it's quite a lot of interesting stories going on in the Triassic period, which just means that it's a very important interval to learn about.
Can I ask you about one
Yeah,
more dinosaur?
yeah,
And it
go
may
for
not
it.
be a dinosaur. So I know another thing, we have a lot of footprints here, especially in Las Cruces and our trackways, are
Mm.
Dimetrodons. So those
Oh, yeah.
aren't dinosaurs. They came before this extinction.
Yeah, so Dimetrodon is one of those proto-mammals that I mentioned before that used to be called, people used to refer to them as mammal-like reptiles. So they kind of superficially look like a reptile, but they are on the line of animals that eventually evolve into mammals. So they are more closely related to us than they are to dinosaurs.
Whoa,
And
that's
they
pretty crazy.
Yeah, and they lived in this Permian period, so that was just before we had this big extinction and before that we get into the Triassic period. So if we go, so this is, yeah, just approximately what the world looked like in the Triassic period. We got this big supercontinent called Pangaea. Pretty much all the land masses were connected. And New Mexico would be, I don't know if I'm to guess, somewhere around here probably at the time. Whereas Australia got South America, Africa, India, and Antarctica, and then we have Australia down here again at what we termed high latitudes or in the polar regions for at least half our continent. And if you kind of look at the color scheme here as well, the interpretation is that the regions just around and near the equator was much more arid than what we expect to see down in Australia, which means that what we're finding of fossils in our area might be very different than what we find in New Mexico because the climate is very different. So that means
So
that it's important to try and fill those fossil gaps to get an understanding of what that might have actually looked like.
this sort of looks a lot to me like something I heard about in school, which was Pangea. So this is
Yes,
almost like a supercontinent. There was not, we weren't spread all over the world yet. It looks like we were just one big supercontinent.
that's right. So you can kind of make out where the continents are, the way they become, in present day. But yeah, all these continents were connected into this almost C shape called the supercontinent Pangaea. And it was sort of towards the end of the Jurassic period and into the early Jurassic that it started breaking up, sort of in this area and in this region, starting to form the Atlantic Ocean, which again caused extinction events as well. But yeah, I suppose, technically speaking, an animal could walk all the way from modern day China through Europe and North America, South America, Antarctica, and to Australia. But there are possibly some environmental and ecological barriers for animals to have been able to do that because the way we see animals appearing at least to be distributed in the Triassic period suggests that there might have been some barriers across here preventing animals from immediately walking across. And that might have been mountain ranges, it might have been climate, or other barriers that prevented animals from spreading immediately to other regions.
Now, this may be a niche reference, but that would really have to be
Awesome.
probably a Forrest Gump dinosaur to really go that distance.
You need some good shoes, that's for sure. So this is just so there's this website called the Paleobiology Database, which someone really interested might want to visit because we can essentially look up any fossil group and you can plot around the world where fossils of that group has been found. So what
Oh,
I've
that's
done here,
cool. I'll do this
so
along with you right now. And then when we run this in the classroom, for those of you in class, this is where we'll pause and I'll pull this up on the computers.
excellent. So that's what I've done here. So I've essentially plotted Permian Triassic tetrapods. They're the four-limbed vertebrate fossils worldwide. So the Permian ones are here in the orangey red, and we got these Triassic ones here in purple. So just to highlight the distribution of where fossils have been found so far. And as you can see, both in the Permian and in the Triassic, most of the fossil sites are in the northern hemisphere, with the exception of South Africa, which has a very fossiliferous unit called the Karoo Basin. Similarly, in for Triassic fossils, mostly in northern hemisphere, and it doesn't mean that's because there aren't any fossils in the southern hemisphere. It just means that exploration in the southern hemisphere, in particular South America, Antarctica, and Australia, started much more recently. So where you've had, a couple of hundred years at least of exploration for fossils in the northern hemisphere, we've only had less than 100 years exploration in the southern hemisphere. So which is why it's so important to start filling those gaps because our interpretations are going to be heavily biased towards the northern hemisphere data sets, whereas we don't know relatively little about what's going on in the southern hemisphere. So it just also to show to your listeners, I suppose, that, you know, even though it might appear to some people that we've sort of explored everywhere, it is so far from the truth. Like even here in just in Queensland, in the little state, well, I say little state of Queensland, or a big state, but in the state of Queensland, which is small on the global scale, there are more localities around here that have remained unexplored or underexplored that I can explore in my lifetime or my career here at the museum. So we've just scratched the surface so far. So anyone that's interested in paleontology, there's plenty of exploration left to do as long as you're willing to and have the funds to get out there. So that brings us to what we're doing here in Queensland, where we have these basins, or we call it, which are these depositional centers, or where mudstone and sandstones will lay down in the Triassic period through rivers and lake systems. And we are going into these areas and we explore for fossils from the Triassic period. And a lot of them look like this one here. This one's called the crater. It's not an actual crater. It's just well, the way the rock is eroded out, it makes it look like a bowl or a crater structure. But you can see there's some reddish brown and some lighter colored. And these lighter colored rocks are sands. So they're the channels where the currents were running faster and only coarse-grained sand were deposited. And the brown or reddish brown is the lake deposit, or the lake deposits where the flow of water was slow and allowed these fine-grained sediments to deposit. So essentially big floodplains, and you can imagine a river channel, and then on the sides of the river you might have little lakes that are on over the banks or on the flats. And that's sort of the environment we have, and the location of the lakes and location of the river channel itself changes over time. So it sort of moves around. And that's again, yeah, what the rock looks like in the fields. You can see these alternating structures and essentially just channels sort of moving around. One point you got lakes, and then the channel moves and it comes in across the lake, and then you got a lake again as the channel moves again, and so on and so on.
Well, that's
And
really
within,
cool. I'm actually following you along on this paleo database, or this paleo database you referenced me to. This is actually pretty cool.
yeah, no, it's an excellent source, and a lot of researchers recently as well use the data there for statistical modeling of distribution of animals over time and fossils over time, which is really, so it's a really great resource, really. And these are some of the fossils that we find there. So we're finding a lot of amphibians. So these are amphibians. We call them stem amphibians because when we think of amphibians, we're thinking salamanders, frogs, and for anyone that's really into amphibians, you might also think of the caecilians, which are the legless amphibians that burrow in the ground. They are the ones that we have today. But prior to them, in the Carboniferous and Permian and Triassic period and so on, you had these other amphibians who kind of were the ancestors to modern amphibians, and these are called the temnospondyls. And you get some of those, I know, as well in New Mexico. You get them at Ghost Ranch and other Triassic and Permian localities. You get them as well. And some of them, some of them look like different shaped salamanders kind of things with different
I was
shaped
gonna
heads.
say that looks kind of like our axolotls here at the museum.
Yeah, I imagine, yeah. Some of them would. And some of them, you know, long, almost crocodile or alligator-like heads. And some of them have more triangular shaped heads. And you get all kinds of different shaped heads. So these were the amphibians, if you like, of that time period. So they were all living in the rivers and the lakes and so on. And you get smaller ones that were only a few, what do we call it? Maybe, you know, 10 inches or so in length or even less, and up to several meters as well. So we get plenty of those, and we also get reptiles, but the reptiles we have so far are relatively small. You get these things called proclophonids that some of them were burrowing, some of them were herbivorous, and some were insect eaters, and they kind of look like a squat little lizard of today. And we get other lizard-like animals that kind of look like more upright walking monitor lizards. And then we get the slightly larger reptiles that are on the line closer to dinosaurs and crocodiles, like Callisuchus is slightly larger. Archosaur, we call these things. So they were kind of the main group of vertebrates that we'd found in that area prior to our work. And this is kind of how we imagined the scene might look. Obviously, just like in every diorama, all the animals are in the scene all at once, which is not necessarily how you expect it in real life. Because usually what happens is if you go out, and it's probably the same where you are, you go out and you try and see animals, and you usually see birds and some insects and nothing else because everything else is hiding, especially during the day. So going out in the Triassic, you might not see very much, but what you could see are temnospondyls, which are these amphibians. You might see little proclophonid reptiles. You might see some saws. You might see some monitor lizard-like looking things, and some different types of fish, lungfish. and regular ray fin fish. And the plants obviously look very different as well, whereas now we have most of our trees are either leaf trees or needle trees, whereas back in the Triassic period, you had trees that are closely related to modern day horsetails on the ground you can see here, and lycopods, which are these club mosses, or what do you call them? Some places they're called like squirrel tail mosses, but they grew tall as trees in those days. So the I suppose the flora of the plant life was very different than what you would see today as well. But over the last 5 years or so, we've been collecting fossils from these sites, and this is again one of the sites in this photo here, and you can see these alternating light and dark bands again of river sands and lake sands. And we sleep in pretty simple camps. We just have a tent each, and we just cook our food on a campfire. So it's only at the moment it's only three of us, myself and two of my students, that go out every year and spend as much time as we can collecting fossils from these localities.
That's
And
beautiful. Actually, that looks a lot like New Mexico.
yeah, I bet. Yeah, and this is one of those temnospondyls, just to see what it looked like in the ground. So these light-colored bits that you can see here is what we found on the surface. So these are the sun-bleached bits of bone that's been exposed for a bit longer time than what we exposed under the rock. We can see, it sort of highlights, I suppose, how tricky it is to spot the bone within the rock. But this is one of the side of the lower jaws here, and the skull, top of the head, is just following this outline I'm drawing with this pointer here. And that's the tip of the snout, essentially, that was sticking out. And one of the lower jaws had fallen off and was sitting here right next to the skull, and you can kind of make out the teeth on the top margin right there.
And what era is this again?
What area?
What era?
Oh, era. So this is all the Triassic.
Okay.
This is similar, a bit younger than the Chinle Formation, which is what you see at Ghost Ranch.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was actually just looking at our little area here to see what dinosaurs we would find in both Australia and New Mexico, and I found iguanodons that were just a couple hours from where I'm at, and it looks like you also have some iguanodons over there in Australia.
Yeah, so we got some early, we got some early what we call ornithopods here as well, and we got a Matabarosaurus that looks a little bit like an iguanodon, I suppose. Yeah, but that's not fun. Yeah, so these are all these fossils here from the Triassic are sort of before and during the time of the very, very first dinosaurs, like
Okay.
coelophytes that you guys have. And there's some more of these amphibians, temnospondyls, so they kind of look a bit like slippers. These heads that you find in the rock, so it's the tip of the snout, so the skull had sort of caved in. There's another one sitting in this gully here. So they were, just to show how rich it is as well, this is the distance between those two specimens. So they're
Oh,
pretty
wow.
close. So we go out, this is a fairly small locality of, maybe roughly about 50 by 100 meters in area, but we're finding easily 20, 30 fossils or specimens there every time we go there. So extremely rich localities, and we're finding not only big ones but tiny ones as well. This is the head of or part of the head of a little temnospondyle, little amphibian. So you can kind of see that's this little nostril right there, and that piece actually fits onto this blob that you see here. And inside this blob are bones of the head and body of this little amphibian, and sort of in the shadow here, stretched behind here, is the backbone of it. So we actually have most of the head and a lot of the body of this little fella as well. So that's pretty cool, because most of the time in finding these things at other localities, they are either very fragmentary or they're completely squished flat. Whereas all our material is three-dimensionally preserved and undistorted, so and preserves exceptional detail. Some of these teeth in these little jaws are only about 0.5 millimeter thick, which is tiny, tiny, tiny. And we're finding more of these other reptiles as well. This is just another slide to show how difficult it is to spot the bones in the rock. If you sort of squint and use your imagination, you can see there's little darker bits where these arrows are indicating, and they are little finger bones from the limb of one of these slightly larger reptiles, and there's little bits of bone here as well. So these are just specimens that we've still got to prep out. This is part of its jaw, and you can see this is a sort of broken off tooth crown right here sitting in the jaw. This is it here. And you can see the little serrated edge here as well on the side. So it preserves a fairly good amount of detail even in these larger animals too.
So, do you mind if I ask you a question? I've seen a couple of these dinosaurs now that have the
Yeah.
second part of their name is Sukai or Suka.
Yeah.
And I was looking at them on here, and I can see when I click into them, you see them a lot in New Mexico and then in Europe and then also
Mm.
Australia.
Yes. So yeah,
So,
Sucus is typically referring to something that's got to do with crocodile. And the reason why a lot of these amphibians also have often can have a sucus sort of ending is because a lot of them are quite crocodile-like in their head shape. But
Oh, okay, that
mostly,
makes
yeah.
sense.
But most of the time, if you see a name that has anything to do with sucus, it's usually on the crocodile line of reptiles or a crocodile of some sort. Yeah, and we've got these little reptiles as well. So these are kind of monitor lizard-like looking things. These are tiny little pieces. So this whole thing is about 2 centimeters long, but we've got part of the shoulder in this little animal. You can see the kind of the detail that we're getting in even these tiny, tiny little pieces. You can see in my hand here how big these pieces are. Tiny little heads as well. We've got part of a head here with the little jaws and little teeth, and this is part of its hip. So incredible detail there as well. Here's
That looks
another
more
one.
like a bird than a dinosaur.
Yeah, well, that's the funny thing. A lot of these things, now that we're looking into detail, have a lot of features that you do see in some birds, which makes you wonder because there was no birds at this time, whether some of them would have filled similar niches to perhaps insect-eating or fish-eating birds do today, and therefore have developed, although they couldn't fly, perhaps had similar sort of at least structures in the head and jaws. So this is kind of what some of them look like when you find them in the field. They're little bits on the surface. And here's part of the vertebral column or the spine sort of sticking still into the rock there. And we also I found this sandstone layer this year as well that has little bones sort of scattered through it as well. So this is a much more higher energy environment in a little stream or river where bits of bone get sort of jumbled in and you sort of find little bits and pieces here and there. Whereas in the finer mudstone, you're finding things that are articulated, so they're sort of still in the place where they were in the living animal. And then finally, I'm just going to show you something cool that we've done as well, because previously when people have been collecting these things, they've just been collecting the bits and pieces on the surface and gone, oh yeah, that's nice, and there's not much more we can do with it because it's so tiny. You can't really sit there and mechanically prep it out because it's so small and fragile. So what we're doing now is we're CT scanning all of these things. So we have a facility here in Australia called the synchrotron. So it's the Australian synchrotron, which we go down. This is the facility here. It's essentially a big particle accelerator. So it's a circuit where a cannon, an electron cannon, fires an electron into this circuit and it sort of spins around at nearly the speed of light in this circuit. And as it gets deflected by these big magnets as it's going around in this circle, it emits different types of radiation. So one of those are X-ray radiation, and we can fire that X-ray radiation through this channel, through the fossil, and into a detector, which is essentially a camera with a filter in front of it, and take X-ray images as this fossil is spinning around on this stage or mount that we have here. And as it's spinning around, you're getting about 1,800 X-ray images that you can then stack on top of each other and get a three-dimensional X-ray out of it. And what you get at the end is a stack of images. So essentially, if my water ball here is a fossil, you're getting slices up like that of X-ray images. And then if you put all those slices together in a software, you get what we call a stack. So it's a stack of all those images, and if you put those together, you get a three-dimensional X-ray of the fossil that you scanned. And you can see in the individual slices or images, you can see the bone here is the porous spaces, whereas the stuff around is the rock. So traditionally, what you do to try and extract the bones from the rock in these instances, got to sit there and manually draw out what is the outline of the bone and what is the rock. And then you tell that to the computer and it'll render a 3D model if you've done this to every slice image throughout these image stacks. But because these image stacks are about 2,000 images thick, it takes a lot of time to do. It's doable, but it can take months, if not years, to do per fossil. And we've done it to some, and you can see here, this is a little fossil here, and inside you can see there's the vertebrae of this little amphibian. And in this
So
case,
you only have to do this once, the imaging part. All of the work that you're doing is sort of in post then. It's sitting
yeah,
at the computer and going slide by slide by slide
that's
and doing
right.
the
You got to sit
outlining.
there and just draw coloring in essentially.
I hope you have a
Uh,
lot of grad students at.
I know. Well, that's the thing. So we did do it for a while, and this is one of those things as well. We CT scanned a blob of rock that we thought had bone in it, and you can see this got this nice bone inside it as well. You got backbone here, and you got the arm and the shoulder sort of sticking into the rock there as well. So it's pretty cool what you can see with this CT scanning technology. It's just revolutionizing what we can do and what sort of detail we can get out of these fossils. And this is stuff that only, 20 years ago or less even, you wouldn't be able to get any data out of these specimens, because once you try and extract them, you destroy or ruin the specimen essentially. So that was kind of the story traditionally. You take about 2 hours to color in one slide, and if you've got 2,000 slices per data set, then suddenly you have more than 500 working days before you can see three-dimensionally what was inside your sample, which
I
is
think you're going to beat me to my question here, which is I'm guessing there are AIs that are going to do this eventually.
yeah, well, that's the key. That's right. And we published a paper in September last year where we've done exactly that. So what we did, I provided a training data set, so I colored in 10 slices of 2000 instead of every 2000. And I worked with a colleague of mine at James Cook University, who's an AI specialist. And we trained what we call a deep learning model, which is a type of AI, to recognize the way I'd colored in bone and what was bone and what was not bone within this sample. And to a point where it could recognize everything at this high detail. So essentially, instead of doing 2,000 slices, I did 10, and it segmented it out just like that, almost perfectly.
Well, that sounds revolutionary.
Yeah, so what we're doing now is we're building on this model. We're training with different types of data sets, and we're at a point now where, for at least the fossils that we have, where it seems like we don't really need any training data at all. We can just feed it the CT scan and start it one day, and the day after it's segmented out everything. So that's obviously going from spending well over a year to spending 24 hours. Just means that now we can just focus on scanning, chuck it at the computer, and get all this out and get on with the paleontology side of things. So our aim is obviously to have this at some point, to the point where we can share this with everyone. So, a usable graphic user interface that will allow other paleontologists to do the same. And that'll hopefully open up this bottleneck for everyone that's, spending, well, grad students spending most of their, degree segmenting out data rather than working on the data itself. So that's good. So now we're essentially starting to get at a good state. So I'm just going to show you some that we've done. So this is the first one as well that I showed you in the public front of the publication, but just to show you some of the quality of the segmentation that we're getting. So this is part of one of those little reptile heads, and you got part of an amphibian sort of stuck to it as well, which is just that some of these might actually be what we call regurgitites, which is a larger animal has eaten these animals and essentially vomited out the bones, and these bones are therefore clung together. So that's a little hypothesis we have, that at least some of these fossils we find are actually
Like an
vomit
owl
balls.
pellet.
Yeah, essentially, yeah, pellets from a larger animal. We've got another one. So we scan some of the fragments that we find, we scan in vials or cylinders, plastic cylinders. So that's why there's bits and pieces here, but you can see as part of a hand of an amphibian, it's another bit part of a hand, it's a bit of the skull, it's another bit of the skull. And then once we've got this, even if the fossil is fragmentary or broken up on the surface, I can import these into a 3D software, and I can puzzle everything together, which saves me having to sit here with glue and everything and try and do it with the fragile stuff, and I can just do it virtually.
So
And
less
it's
time in the office and more time in the field. That's the goal.
That's right, that's the goal. And also getting to the data quicker, not having to sit there and wait for things to be physically prepared out of the rock, but just being able to go there for 3 days, scan the specimens, chuck it through an algorithm and get the data, and then go to the next. It'll just make interpretations of the material a lot quicker and a lot more detailed as well, because the thing is, there might be things preserved in here, like these tiny, tiny little finger bones and everything. You might accidentally prepare your way through, or there might be even things like soft tissue or other cartilage that could be preserved in there that you might not see as you're preparing your way through. Whereas now that we're training this thing, if we see signs of this, we can train the algorithm to recognize that as well. And we can see if that's something that is preserved without having to actually destroy any of the specimen. And we can leave that for future generations when methodologies have improved even further.
Very cool. Now, do you mind if I ask you some questions that are only
No,
sort
go
of what
for it.
related to all of this paleontology you've taught me, Espen?
Yeah, no, go for it. That's my last slide anyway, and I'll just let that spin in the background if you want, and
That
we
sounds
can.
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, so here I wanted to, what I wanted to know is what got you into paleontology? What made you want to become a paleontologist?
Oh, it was a bit of a roundabout way. I think when I was so when Jurassic Park came out, I was 13, I think. And I wanted to become a paleontologist then, but sort of then I sort of drifted away from it. And then when I was 16 again, I can't remember what happened, but then I asked my dad because we only have one university in Oslo that teaches paleontology, and Norway, sorry, that teaches paleontology, and that's the capital in Oslo. And my dad was living right and around there at the time, and he went in and got all the paperwork of what I needed to do. But then, I was only 16 then, so it was still another 2, 3 years before I could even go to uni if I wanted to. So I kind of ended up in the military for 3 years in between then and uni. And then when I finally made my way to uni, I was like, well, I'm interested in all kinds of science. I like astronomy, I like biology, I like physics, I like geology. So it sort of just started on all these things and ended up doing biology. And then once I finished my bachelor's degree, I was like, okay, now I need to do a master's. What can I do? And there wasn't really anything interesting in the biology department. So I hooked up with the only vertebrate paleontologist in Norway, and we came up with a project working on dinosaurs actually from Canada, on the ornithomimids from there. And I was looking at the beak structures from that, and also some from Mongolia. So that was pretty cool. And from there, I sort of got involved in the work in Svalbard that I told you about in the beginning. And that became part of my PhD. So I described several new species of plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs for my PhD. And during that time, I met my partner who's Australian, and that's how I ended up in Australia. And things are just sort of snowballed from kind of just going with the flow, being a general interest in science, and just happened to end up in paleontology. And I think it doesn't, you don't need to know exactly what you want to do from the start. Some people do, and that's, great, but not everyone does. But I think sometimes just start on something. If you've got a general interest in science, usually people that are interested in science are so because they're interested in asking questions and trying to find out the answers, why and how and so on. And that's kind of what drove me as well, and still driving me now. And therefore trying to fill the gaps in our knowledge, the bigger gaps. So that's why I started on this Triassic. What do we know about the Triassic in Australia, and how can it inform us about what happened in the Triassic globally and after this extinction, and how things evolved, and all that sort of thing. So I think asking questions is the big key, and yeah, just sort of stick with it, I suppose. If there's something you're interested in, don't give up. It's worth it if you're really into it. I think it's really worth sticking to it.
Very cool. And just for those of you that are from Las Cruces or from New Mexico listening in, so in New Mexico, we actually do have a whole school of paleontology over at UNM. I know we have a whole paleontology collections over there. And I do know that some people research this stuff over at NMSU in Las Cruces as well.
Yeah, that's
So
brilliant. And you got some great, well, if you're paleontologist or interested in paleontology, you got some great localities, especially the Permian and the Triassic. So excellent place for paleontology if that's what you're interested in. And you're surrounded by other interstate localities as well. So the US is a great place for paleontology.
awesome. Well, I mean,
Hmm.
that's all the questions I had for you, Espen.
No, that's good. Thanks for the talk. It was excellent. It's great to meet you guys. And yeah, hopefully we can chat some other time as well, and maybe even meet in person.
Awesome. Well, for all of you guys that joined us, I want to thank you for your time, and I appreciate you guys tuning into Science Cafe. Hope you have yourselves a wonderful day.